Chapter 27, Circulatory and Respiratory Systems. Blood is the fluid of the circulatory system. It carries many substances, including dissolved respiratory gases, through the body. The heart pumps blood through vessels. Blood vessels lead to the respiratory surfaces where blood exchanges gases with the environment. They also lead to body tissues where blood exchanges gases and nutrients. Blood consists of cells suspended in a liquid extracellular matrix called plasma. Plasma is mostly water, but also contains antibodies and many other dissolved substances. Plasma carries red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells carry oxygen to body tissues. Red blood cells contain hemoglobin, a protein that binds to oxygen at respiratory surfaces and unloads oxygen at body tissues. If you look here at blood, what it's made up of, plasma is about 55%, cells and cell fragments are 45%, very little white blood cells overall. Okay. White blood cells are part of the immune system. They provoke inflammation and destroy microbes, among many other functions. Platelets are cell fragments that initiate blood clotting. Platelets adhere to each other at a break in a blood vessel. Plasma proteins called clotting factors reinforce the clot. Lay down these. Here's an electron micrograph here. They lay protein fibers over the clotted platelets to eventually attract resources and repair the blood vessel. Some functions of the blood: gas exchange, carries oxygen from the tissue, from the lungs to the tissues, and CO2 from the tissues to the lungs. Carries nutrients absorbed by the digestive system throughout the body. Carries urea, a waste product of protein metabolism, to the kidneys for excretion in urine. Carries hormones, which are secreted by endocrine glands. Creation of interstitial fluid, surround cells, forms from blood plasma. Regulates blood pH, regulates cells, water content, generates pressure gradient, and keeps plasma in capillaries. Absorbs heat and dissipates it at the body's surface. Blood clots plug damaged vessels. White blood cells destroy foreign particles and participate in the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is a natural response to any kind of perceived pathogen. A pathogen is a disease-causing organism. There are also antigens. Antigens are perceived as disease-causing organisms, even though, in fact, they are not. Blood travels through circulatory systems, which have several different forms. We'll look at some of these. There's the open circulatory system, like in the grasshopper. And in the grasshopper, there's a cavity with a heart, and it just circulates fluid in the cavity. Then there's a closed circulatory system, and the blood stays in vessels all the time and comes out, and fluid comes out of capillary beds to bathe tissues in this fluid and brings nutrients and oxygen to the tissues that just diffuse out of these capillaries. And it takes CO2 and other waste products into the bloodstream from the tissues. Here's a comparison of a fish's circulatory system to a mammal's. Okay, fish has a two-chambered heart, ventricle, and an atrium, and it's just a single circuit that goes through. Okay, the gills pick up oxygen. The red blood shows oxygenated blood, while the blue blood is non-oxygenated blood. The blood in the gills picks up oxygen, while the blood down in the system, the systemic circulation, the blood oxygen diffuses into the tissues, and blue are areas that are deoxygenated blood, meaning that here in the systemic circulation, that's the body circulation, the oxygen picked up in the lungs diffuses out into the tissues while CO2 diffuses in. And by the time it's heading towards the heart again, it is pretty much deoxygenated. Now, the four-chambered mammalian or bird heart is a little different. Okay. The left atrium, there's a right ventricle, a left ventricle, and a right and left atrium. This is a four-chambered heart. So we can start at the right atrium. The right atrium pumps blood into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it pumps out into what is called the pulmonary circulation. This is the circulation in the lungs. So blood's flowing into the right atrium. It gets pumped in to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's pumped out, goes up to the pulmonary circulation. These are the lungs. In the lungs, it picks up oxygen and becomes the red oxygenated blood. From the lungs, it's pumped down back to the left atrium. From the left atrium, it's pumped into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it comes out of the aorta, okay, and goes down to the body, the systemic circulation, where the oxygen is used in the body and it diffuses out of the blood and into the tissues. And then you get deoxygenated blood here, okay? Now, arteries always leave the heart, and veins lead back to the heart. Now, arteries, with one exception, all have oxygenated blood. The exception is up here. This artery coming out of the right ventricle is called the pulmonary artery. And it hasn't had a chance to pick up oxygen yet. So this oxygen is picked up in the lungs. And then you have the pulmonary vein, which returns blood to the left atrium. The pulmonary vein is the only vein that has oxygenated blood. Everywhere else in the circulation, the arteries leave the heart and have oxygenated blood, and the veins come towards the heart and have deoxygenated blood. Now let's look at reptiles. Reptiles have got an incomplete kind of three-chambered heart. Basically, it's inefficient because this septum here in the heart there's a hole there. And so blood comes in on the left side of the heart, but it's not efficient. It pumps back out of this atria. It's got a single atria and two ventricles. And this atria pumps it up through the lungs and back down into this heart, and then it gets squeezed back out. Okay? And so the two ventricles have a hole in the heart. But reptiles, since they are not endotherms, ectotherms, meaning they don't maintain a constant body temperature, this arrangement provides enough oxygen for the metabolism of the animal. But the animal does have a much wider range of temperatures. So the ectotherms, like reptiles, to help warm up, use things like sunlight and other heat sources to warm themselves up and become active. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back to the heart. Capillaries are the tiniest blood vessels, and they have capillary beds all through the body to get blood to the tissues. Here is a better picture of a human heart. Now you have the superior vena cava. This is a vein that empties blood into our right atria. This little valve here is the right atria, pumps blood through this valve down into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it leaves here through this valve and goes up. This is the pulmonary artery. It's the only artery in the body without oxygenated blood, and it sends blood around to the lungs, one to each lung. It picks up blood that's been oxygenated from the lungs, and it is pumped back in through the pulmonary veins to the heart. Remember, veins run to the heart. This is the only vein in the body with oxygenated blood. So this oxygenated blood goes into the left atria, and from there it's pumped into the left ventricle. And then you can see right here that valve that I'm pointing at leaves the left ventricle, comes out in the aorta, and goes through the body. Basically, the left half of the heart receives blood from the body, and the right half pumps blood out towards the body. Here is a diagram showing it again in another way, and some of the other circulations. Here's your pulmonary circulation, the lungs, right? And they are fed from the right ventricle through the pulmonary arteries. They come back into the left atria in the pulmonary veins, and then from there they're pumped out of the aorta to several different circulations. There's the blood that goes up to the head, you have the liver, the intestines, the kidneys, and the lower body. Right? The heart pumps, and this will show you kind of the direction, if you look at these little arrows, that the blood is flowing through. So here we've got it leaving the right atrium towards the lungs, the pulmonary circulation. Here it's coming back to the heart, these little arrows from the lungs, that's the pulmonary vein. Then it pumps through the left atria into the left ventricle, and from there pumps out through the aorta, out through the aorta to the various circulations. And this is just a constant process. Now, your heart is made of cardiac muscle, which is electrically stimulated. The cardiac muscle is constantly depolarizing, rather. And you have what is called this pacemaker, the SA node. And your heart has to function in a very specific way, because just like a muscle that depolarizes, what happens is the depolarization wave starts here at the pacemaker. Okay, that depolarizes, then it spreads. So basically, you have the right atria and the left atria are pumping blood into the ventricles, and so the atria depolarize first, and that cardiac muscle contracts and squeezes blood into the two ventricles, and then after these start relaxing, then the ventricles pump and squeeze the blood either from the right ventricle to the lungs or from the left ventricle to the body. Okay, all the way up here to the AV node. That's where it ends. So imagine it's thump, okay, that's squeezing blood to the ventricles, thump to the body. Okay? And so it's a constant alternating muscle contraction. The atria thump, ventricles thump. So thump, 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 thump. And you get that thump, thump. It's called the lub-dub system. I didn't name it. But it's these valves that close. The first one is these valves between the atria and the ventricles, and the second is the valves going to the lungs and the body. Okay? So this kind of shows, basically, here it is again. And the pacemaker is constantly keeping these. It's atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles, atria, ventricles. So it depolarizes from here to here, and they all squeeze blood into the ventricles. Then the blood is squeezed from the ventricles either towards the lungs or towards the body. Now, this can get out of whack, okay, and can cause problems. If this SA node, the pacemaker node, starts ceasing to function, doesn't function very effectively, you can use medications and even electroshock to try to get this back into whack. All right. This is one of many diseases of the heart. It tends to happen later in life, depending on how healthy your heart is. So you might ask, how do I keep my heart healthy? Aerobic exercise, swimming, walking, bicycling, playing a sport, etc. Keep that blood pumping through your heart with as few beats as possible. The stronger your heart, the fewer times it has to beat to pump the blood everywhere it needs to go. And so you don't want to let your heart get up into the 90-95 beats per minute. That's pretty unhealthy. Okay. Now, blood vessels form the circulation pathway, and what it does, you've got like the aorta to the artery. The arteries lead into various arterioles, which lead to a capillary bed, which are picked up in a venule, come up through a vein, and back to the heart. So we have, in blood vessels, we have arteries and veins, arterioles and venules, and capillaries. Okay? The way you can tell on a slide, if you're looking at a cross-section of arteries have higher pressure. Okay? And so they tend to have these thicker walls of muscle. And then this space inside the artery is called the lumen, Lumen, and blood transfers through it. Your diet, if you eat lots of cholesterol and fats and stuff, things will form inside there that are occlusions. Just on the sides, certain fat and plaque will start adhering and will lead to problems further down the line. Okay? Now, by the time the blood gets back to the heart, it's almost at 0 parts per million pressure. The highest pressure is the aorta, the lowest pressure is at the vena cava. And veins are thinner walled because they don't need to be as thick. They're not as thick because the pressure is much lower. The muscle in these veins and arteries is smooth muscle. It's not striated or skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is involuntary. Your body basically pumps this blood through the vessels and uses the smooth muscle around these blood vessels to pump. And when you get to your veins heading back towards your heart, you have these little one-way valves. And your muscles basically help squeeze blood through these little one-way valves back towards the heart to give it a little more pressure and kind of squeeze it. As you contract the muscles in your arms and legs and stuff, it pumps blood back towards your heart. Doctors measure your blood pressure using this thing here. It's a little arm cuff, sphygmomanometer. It's very hard to say. The higher reading, systole, reflects the pressure in the arteries when the ventricles contract, and the lower reading reflects the pressure in the arteries when the ventricles relax. So up here, they're contracting. Down here, they're relaxing. And the ventricles, again, are the ones in your heart. Okay? Now, to help regulate blood pressure, you have a few things that you can do. If your blood pressure is too high, that will stretch your blood vessels more. And there are little sensors in various nerve sensors in various parts of the circulation that will measure how much pressure is there. And in that case, hang on. Sorry, had to cough there. So, blood pressure is too high. A receptor, a nerve ending, tells your body that it's too high. So the arterioles in the skin dilate, meaning that the lumen becomes larger. As the lumen becomes larger, it lowers blood pressure and your heart rate will decrease. Then if your heart rate gets too low, okay, and the same nerve receptors or different nerve receptors sense that, they send something to your brainstem that says, hey, we don't have high enough blood pressure, your arterioles will constrict, get smaller, and that reduces the volume and increases the blood pressure. And there are several medications that can do that as well. This is part 1 of chapter 27, the cardiovascular system.